the obvious thing I remember about Smallhythe was that weird sensation of it being 8 miles from the sea.
But with the sea nowhere in sight yet central to the story. Yes, yeah, it was like doing something virtual reality, wasn't it?
It was like we were arriving there, and apparently we were looking for Henry V's boats. Was it Henry V?
I think so. Yes, yeah, the Jesus, wasn't it? Yeah.
And you remember the name, yeah, the Jesus. And it was like we were in a situation where we'd arrived in the middle of nowhere, miles and miles from the sea, and apparently we were supposed to be looking for boats.
Or for a boat that might not be there any longer, beside the sea that was definitely not there any longer. For some archaeology that might never have been there at all. Typical Time Team goal, really, wasn't it?
I think I vaguely remember at the time that we needed to have a really good reconstruction cameo, just in case we absolutely found. What do you remember about that sort of early process of arriving there and sitting in those fields? And when did stuff first start coming out that made you think, oh, we might actually find something here?
It was one of those ones where you did wonder if it was going to produce anything at all. I mean, I think the whole almost the first couple of days, I think, certainly the first day and a half, it just felt like one stab in the dark after the next, really. And it was kind of sort of darting from one site to the other. I mean, as we started doing the digging in that Delft field without any geophys, didn't we? Which is kind of unusual for us. So we didn't really have a target. There was just this idea that it looked about the right shape. So we'd put an enormous trench down it that just seemed sort of so random somehow. And didn't turn up very much, I don't think. And we found some wood, but that was all prehistoric. I remember poor Gus being a bit deflated that no one was interested in the prehistoric wood. It was like, yeah, sort of the wrong answer to the right question, as it were.
Because subsequently, I don't know whether this was the first one, but we kind of subsequently had quite a run of boats on Time Team. We did one in Southampton.
Yes, and then we did that wreck off Cape Wrath, didn't we? Diving.
Which had that remarkable Spanish pottery with it, Majolica pottery. But I think this was one of those exercises, archaeologically speaking, I suppose you're talking about a huge organic lump of stuff, mainly made of wood and rope and bits and pieces. It hadn't gone down in a tragedy like the Mary Rose. So effectively it had been parked in the mud and gradually dissolved and sank. But thank God, what was connected with it were all those bolts, the rows that, do you remember, I think John did some weird seismic geophysics or something. And we
sort of it involved hitting the ground with a mallet, as far as I can see, which looked like sort of Fred Flintstone's approach to geophysics, really. But it worked, I think, as far as I can remember. It did sort of come out with a sort of it came out with the readings that looked like it was some waterway that could have been used, because we never got to dig that bit to test the hypothesis, of course. So I think they were fairly confident that it worked.
And I think the thing that Mick quite enjoyed about it was the fact that we actually found that workshop as part of the dig. It was a sort of a, because on one level you had in mind we were looking for a boat. We knew the name of it, and it was Henry V, presumably created as part of a fleet to go across and attack the French. And here was this boat that ended up stuck up this creek. So it was a fairly important boat, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, I can't remember all of the history now. I can't remember if I was ever involved in taking the fleet across, and I can't even remember if we knew it had definitely sort of been left at Smallhythe, or whether it was just stripped and recycled, and whether actually, I don't think we really knew how much of it was actually going to be left. I mean, I must admit, it wasn't a site I was desperately interested in when we first arrived, but like everything, you get drawn into the hunt. And I like the fact that we were looking for a site rather than, I think the shipwrecks somehow, it's sometimes a bit random, some of them, almost like a dropped small find because they just happen to be where they are. But it was frustrating, Dick, because there was just so little trace necessarily. So that workshop was really important because we actually found a feature. I mean, it was the one feature really we got in situ, all those sort of bricks. And until right at the very end, when we found that sort of hull, or where it looked like the hull had sort of, you know, we'd actually got a feature going under another feature, and that's so unusual in archaeology. Usually, if something goes under something, then it's earlier than it. But you know, we could see in the sort of trench, you could see with the sort of hull of the ship, and sat there and washed in with silt that had been washed in with the water, and then the silt had built up around the outside of it, and then of course the wood had rotted away. But I think I felt sorry for the cameraman really on that shoot, because it was really all shades of brown. It was, and yeah, the roves and the bolts were at least chunks of brown, but it was you know, the chromatic span of the shoot was about that wide, wasn't it?
Well, I think it was quite lucky as well that we had Damien with us. I don't know how many shoots you did with Damien, but Damien...
There were a few, I think, weren't there? Yeah, anything that involved wood, because I can't remember the first one he did, but he's very good on, I mean, he's a lovely, lovely guy, but he's great on telly as well, because it's a very gentle, quiet, sort of calm capability about him, and loves his subject.
He might be gentle and calm to chat to, but I can tell you, if things aren't getting done at the right speed and in the right way, he has a tremendously dedicated attitude to whatever he does. We did Llangors Lake. Do you remember the log boat at Llangors?
Yes, yeah, I remember going out in that. I remember going out the flipping lake in it, and it had about that much clearance of water, sort of, because they're designed to sit very low.
And I think
I was just pleased I was in a wetsuit.
We'd managed to find you an oversized dry suit to get you actually into the water, a big red thing.
Yes.
And I'd said to Damien originally, we need a log boat, Damien. And he said, right, okay, fine, you know, made in the, obviously an Iron Age style, if you like. And he said it's going to take about 3 weeks. And I said, well, you know, any chance if we gave you some lights, you could do it in 3 days. And he brought in a team of people who he drove like fury through the night to get this boat done, and then covered it with grease. And then finally, when it went across the water, it seemed to pursue its own route. But at Smallhythe, we'd given him the job. It's an interesting thing about boat building, is this thing about clinker boat building, where, if I'm right, I hope, that you kind of overlay the wood, and the gap has got to be stuffed with oakum that was traditionally produced by prisoners, I think, made by rolling cotton and then tarring it, and then forcing it.
Tar or something, wasn't it? Yeah.
And luckily, we had that on that shoot, and we've got Damien. Sue Francis got involved because somebody had to roll the oakum. But we made that, I don't know if you remember that side of a boat with all those things with great thick planks of oak.
Yeah, all sort of riveted together by the bolts and the roves. Yeah.
And it made me appreciate, you know, what it took to make that section. They were making these things, you know, 100 times the length of our little piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And 2 sides of it, and it had to float. And works all very well for us. Is it going to keep water out just the sea? But yeah, and I mean, and how, you know, it's got to be seasoned timber, which is really hard, because if you do it with unseasoned, presumably it'll then warp, and then it won't fit, and then it won't be watertight. So, yeah, no, I think that might have been a bit of a push for a 3-day cameo to do a whole boat.
Yes. But I was very pleased. I think Phil got quite into the idea of it as well. But what we gradually seem to be doing, as you said, you got the sense of the number of trades involved in that boat. So there's 100 oak trees or whatever it takes, then the planking of them, and then the tarring, the rope, and then these ruddy great ship's nails or rows with a washer, all of which had to be burned through, I think it was, and then the end bent up and then bashed against a washer. It was quite a process.
Yes, and you can see, I mean, they're enormous. When you think how relatively small people's houses were at that time, and I mean, okay, in towns you've got 3-story townhouses and so on, but you know, when you think how, as a timber structure, they're vast and have to be really effectively engineered, that you can see why, you know, they're the kind of that fleet, particularly for an island kingdom, you know, that fleet is, it really is the jewel in your crown, really. I mean, it enables you to secure your territory, but also they're just such high status things. But also, I guess that's why the materials from them is reused. You find ships' timbers in houses and things like that, you know, and the resources that they consume. You know, the amount of forest in the country is depleted during the medieval period, and a lot of that's coming from shipping. But the fact they're taking timbers away and the nails and all the rest of it is why there could easily have been very little at Smallhythe at all. I mean, there could have been virtually nothing there if they were just stripping these structures down in the maritime equivalent of a, you know, junkyard. You know, we could have been left with virtually nothing.
And have you been to see the Mary Rose?
Yeah, but a long time ago.
Long time ago, because it is one of the great. I mean, in a sense, I suppose there was two things it made me think of. That boat, the ability to build those boats was a bit like the same ability to build a medieval roof, except turned upside down. There was some similar.
It's the same principle, isn't it? The overlapping timbers and the kind of water runs down. But if your roof leaks, you don't drown. Well, unless it's leaking really badly.
I think it was, I remember feeling quite tense about the whole thing, but it gradually, because we stuck at it, we ended with the furnace, the workshop for the nails. And I think on the final day, you found a small boat or a separate boat. You found a line of nails. I remember that, seeing the photograph of it.
Yeah, there was that sort of linear feature, wasn't there, which we thought might have been the edge of some kind of slipway or jetty or something, I think. And then there was the bit where the hull had been in the sand and sort of silted up differentially either side of it. I mean, it was that was right at the, as always, of course, that was right at the end of day 3 that we actually found something that did look like it was a boat, but it was only a small bit of it we got there. It would have been interesting to see what it might actually have turned into if we'd found that at, you know, 10:30 on day 1 sort of thing, quite what it might have turned into. Maybe it was a boat, and maybe it would have been something else. But yeah, but we did at least find something that looked reasonably convincing by the end of day 3.
And it was that was one of the, I'm not sure it was the first occasion, I think that we came across the whole diatom issue. And I always remember that I was sort of slightly fascinated by this, because at the Archbishop of Canterbury's palace in London,
Lambeth, I remember doing the diatoms at Lambeth Palace, because they were a really critical part of the argument there. I don't remember them coming in much at.
And I think it was the same person, Jane Siddell. And, you know, in archaeological terms, this is archaeological science, where something like a diatom is the smallest, you know, one of the smallest bits of evidence you get, but it's critical for a number of reasons. Do you have some sense of how diatoms work in this sort of situation?
Well, I can't remember them being a big part of the argument in Smallhythe, but I mean, the principle is you can tell whether they're saltwater or freshwater, can't you? So you can tell how far, whether you could tell you'd got an estuarine channel there because they were saltwater diatoms.
I think they proved that channel those boats were in had been formerly connected with the sea.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Because my vague understanding is that the saltwater diatoms are different from...
Yeah, it's definitely, you can tell salt from fresh. As I don't remember that coming in much at Smallhythe. Maybe I was off doing something else. I mean, Smallhythe was one of those sites where it was a bit of work here, and then we're going to look at this bit, and then we're going to have a look here, and then we'll have a look somewhere else. Because it was a huge landscape, and we had to try and get a grip of it somehow. It had changed so much, hadn't it? It was just, you know, the sea was miles away, and it wasn't really till you got up in the helicopter that you could sort of see where you'd got the kind of flat landscape with the drainage channels that were part of the bit that had been, well, wetland, or the channel, and then you've got the slightly higher land to one side. But you know, it was disorientating, really, wasn't it, when you first arrived?
Yes, and I was also quite relieved in a sense that we nearer we got to thinking we'd actually got something, then at least Victor could start drawing his pictures, because Victor's pictures of these wonderful boats were absolutely fantastic. And I thought, wow, that, you know, somehow this huge, massive thing has dissolved or been taken apart or whatever. And yet we did actually manage to find some bits of it, which I think was a sort of a victory in the end.
I think when you've got that reconstruction drawing that brings alive, you've got a tiny little chunk of something in your hand, or a sort of vague brown line in a section of a trench, you know, some of the drawings that bring it alive is just brilliant. And of course we had the 3D graphics as well. You know, Steve was just starting with those, really, and because you look at them now, and the difference in standard is just unbelievable. And Victor's drawings were so much more lively, really, than the 3D reconstructions. I'm sure the 3D stuff would be amazing these days, but that was, gosh, must be nearly 20 years ago, mustn't it?
Yeah, I've been having a chat with Sue that we're going to put some pieces together about those early days. And did you do the Mammoth shoot?
Yes, Stanton Harcourt, yeah.
She was saying that you know, they were like moving pieces of, you know, very, very expensive equipment out of studios. And
I know, into an enormous muddy crater.
With water dripping from the tent and pieces of plastic over the top of them. And they were putting that, and that was state of the art stuff they were risking, and it was quite fun talking to them.